Hello, and thank you for joining us for this session entitled The Radiologist's Role in Achieving Optimal Positioning for Breast Cancer Detection, Lessons Learned, and How AI Can Improve Image Quality. My name is Mary Beth Chalk, and I lead public and patient involvement at Chiron Medical Technologies. I am excited to be hosting this session, and I'm joined today by a panel of experts in this field who are looking at this from different perspectives, including Dr. Randy Hicks, CEO of the Regional Medical Imaging, one of the leading U.S. imaging centers, Professor Ruud Pineapple, Professor of Radiology and CEO of LRCB, the Dutch Expert Center for Breast Screening and the world's leading independent authority on quality assurance and optimization of screening programs. Also, Dr. Christopher Austin, Chief Medical Officer of Chiron Medical Technologies. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to facilitate this discussion because in December of 2019, during my routine mammogram screening, a suspicious mass the size of a pinhead and nestled against my chest wall was identified. I was later diagnosed with stage 1 invasive ductal carcinoma. But as a result of catching my breast cancer early, my treatment time from diagnosis to the completion of internal beam radiation was 60 days and involved no chemotherapy. So as you can tell, breast screening really matters to me. And as a breast cancer survivor, I understand the critical importance of breast positioning because if my small tumor had been missed due to incorrect positioning or even a misread of the mammogram, my outcome could have been potentially very different. So on December 16th of 2019, I was extremely lucky in that both the technician and the radiologist performed their jobs perfectly, but not all women are so lucky. So let's look at some facts. Breast positioning during image acquisition is one of the most important yet difficult aspects of breast cancer detection and diagnosis. Evidence suggests that technical issues are responsible for delays in diagnosing 22% of screen-detected cancers and 35% of interval breast cancers. And despite the success of MQSA, the Mammography Quality Standards Act, in improving and standardizing the quality of mammographic imaging and the introduction of EQUIP, enhancing quality using the inspection program, poor positioning remains the most common reason for technical failure of American College of Radiology clinical image quality review. So it is critical that radiologists work closely with their technologists to insist on the best possible diagnostic quality mammograms for every woman. These are a few of the key issues that we will be addressing in today's session. But before we jump in, I want to remind you that following the panel discussion, we will be opening up the call for audience questions. So I encourage you during the discussion to enter your questions in the Q&A chat box, which you will find along the bottom of your screens. And during our Q&A session, we will strive to answer as many of your questions as we can. And if we can't get to yours, we'll be happy to follow up afterwards. So let's get started by getting to know one another a little bit better. Professor Pineapple, let me turn to you first. You lead the Dutch National Expert Center for Breast Cancer Screening, known as the LRCB in the Netherlands. Tell us about the organization and its role in national screening quality standards.
Okay, thank you, Mary Beth, for the nice introduction. Yes, LRCB, the Dutch Expert Center for Screening, is appointed by the government in order to monitor the quality and assure the quality. And we do that for the breast screening program. It's a nationwide governmental paid for program. And we do that actually by 3 pillars. First, education and training. The second is audits. We perform audits on regular time schemes. And if we say audit, I'm not only auditing the professionals, but also the equipment. So we are auditing the whole chain of the process of breast cancer screening. So equipment and the performance of the professionals. And there we have formulated standards of quality in which criteria you have to fulfill. Otherwise, you have to be retrained, etc., etc., etc. But we will come up to that later on. And the third pillar of our quality assurance is research and innovation.
Thank you very much. So Dr. Hicks, you're the CEO of the Regional Medical Imaging in Michigan. Tell us about your screening service and your interest in optimal positioning and image quality for mammography.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Yes, I mean, in Michigan, we have 9 imaging centers, and we do mammography in all of our centers. Some of that is remote to us, meaning we're not there as professionals in the buildings oftentimes. But the positioning part of that is really at the forefront of what we're trying to do in detection, and your story tells that story very well, in that as people that are, as professionals that are trying to image patients, we're trying to do the best job we possibly can. That depends a lot on our positioning in getting those patients in the proper position so we can see the very far posterior part of that breast. And that is such a challenge for all of us. I read, upwards to 100 mammograms a day in a screening mode. And that is a very challenging thing for me as I look at those images, recognizing that not all of them are perfect, and trying to decide as a radiologist, when to call a patient back, when not to call a patient back, and what to do with all of that. So it is a very tough challenge for us. And I think with some of the products that are coming along now in artificial intelligence, we're going to have some tools at our hand that can help us with that.
And last but not least, let me turn to my colleague, Dr. Chris Austin.
Thank you, Mary Beth, and thanks for the responses so far. I think from my perspective, what's really exciting here about this particular conversation is that we're moving to a different part of the workflow. Much of what artificial intelligence has been promising to the radiology community is around how it can help augment the decision-making at the time of reviewing an image and making a decision. And what we're finding, and certainly what we're focused on at Chiron, are all those other opportunities where a lot of machine learning is designed to, in a very effective way, to automate some of these technical issues that we introduce as humans. And I think this is a really exciting conversation to really talk about and hear people's different perspectives about the role of AI in different parts of the screening workflow, specifically around image acquisition.
Great. So I know I've spoken about my experience as a patient, but I'd like to focus now on why breast positioning is so important for the screening radiologist. Ruud, I'd like to start with you and hear the LRCB's view on this question.
Well, positioning in our perspective is very, very important. It has to do, of course, with image quality. And I always say, if it's not in the image, it's not going to be detected. So it's very important that whole the breast tissue is being displayed on the mammography. And if the position is suboptimal, of course, you can miss cancers. But on the other hand side, if you have a fold or something else what you don't like in your image, it can lead to a false positive recall. And false positive recalls are really a major drawback of a screening program. It gives a reason for anxiety for women. A huge amount of cost for the community. And what we have seen from research in the Netherlands is that the reattendance rate for women who have had a false positive recall is going down with up to 30%. And that's from the perspective of the radiologist. But if we go to the perspective of the patient, of course, pain. Pain, of course, mammography is a horrible thing to undergo. But on the other hand side, it can be less painful if the positioning is very good. If the bucky is too high or too low, it can be very painful due to faults that are being created. So we think that positioning is very important for a good breast cancer screening program.
Yes, and I know in the US, we refer to technical recall, and then in Europe, positioning recall specifically. Dr. Hicks, I'm curious about your experience of these various scenarios at your center, and how do you as a leader in the organization have visibility into recalls? And then what are the implications on your screening service?
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned, with 9 imaging centers, it's a humongous task for us to try to interact, on a real-time basis with technologists and to try to intercede and have patients correctly positioned if they've been incorrectly positioned, meaning to have them fixed at the time of service. So that recall becomes a really big challenge for us in the sense of most commonly the recall is because we as radiologists either number one, just can't accept the image, or number two, see something at the back of the image that we're very concerned with or concerned enough with to have to bring the patient back. So that is a process that we also look at with MQSA and ACR and all that on a regulatory basis. Every year for MQSA with Equip now on board, we're doing that through the state is actually managing us and auditing us. So we, as radiologists, are interpreting and looking at the images, trying to interpret quality on that side of it. And then each of us looks at each other as far as how we're doing at actually being critical about that interpretation of how the positioning is being done. So we're trying to manage each other, and we're trying to manage the technologists, but it's a very challenging process. And the speed for which we are doing screening studies is very fast. And it has to be based on screening and our capabilities to stay in business and just maintain enough volume to do the services, but also, stay profitable and stay in business. So it's a really, really fast-paced system that is very demanding and very stressful on all sides for the technologists at the time they're reviewing their films on, kind of unbridled without us really there with them. They are having to make judgment calls. And then as radiologists, we're having to make judgment calls based on those images. So it's a fast system that has very little real-time feedback. And that problem is really what stems the issue of this noise in the system all the time.
So Rude, what is the LRCB doing to address the recall issue at the national level?
Yeah, well, we are a little bit different in that perspective because the mammographies are taken into batches in mobile trucks mainly, and then they are sent to a reading station, and the reading takes place for about 1 or 2 days later on. So there is no direct connection between the technician and the radiologist, and therefore that is enacted by law actually in the Netherlands. No matter how good you are as technician, no matter how good you are as a breast radiologist, you have to be trained and certified by us, the LSCB, in order to even join the screening program. If you're not accredited by us, you're not allowed to work in the screening due to the process that we have separated the acquisition of the images and the reading of the images. So there is no direct interaction. We do have interactions, but not on a directly formed basis.
So Dr. Hicks, I know you've touched on this slightly in prior comments, but what does it feel like for a screening radiologist if they receive a suboptimal image and they have to decide whether to proceed to read and report the study or to inconvenience the technologist and the patient by requesting a technical recall?
Yeah, it's a really anxiety producing and a really stressful situation for us. I always feel like when I go home, I worry, should I have called that patient back or should I have done something differently? And I think we all as physicians carry that home with us a lot in our heads. We're always going over cases that we looked at and thought, oh, maybe I should have called that back, or we call it back and then it's all fine. And we were like, oh, I probably shouldn't have called that back. And I think it's really tough on us emotionally and stressful. And I think, as a radiologist that uses artificial intelligence in helping me interpret and have been doing so for about 2.5 years, it has helped me a lot, not in the positioning side, but on the interpretation side. So I'm hoping that by adding artificial intelligence into the technical side of positioning, we'll get some relief of that anxiety that I've gotten with artificial intelligence helping me in interpretation. And I think, you know, as a human, unfortunately, we have this stress and it doesn't go away. It's always with us. And these cases are always in our minds. The Mary Beths of the world are always in our heads, and we don't want to hurt anyone, and we don't want to miss cancers, and we want to do the best we can, but it's not always possible in a system that's so full of, you know, just noise and a lot of issues.
Yeah. And, you know, I consider myself to be so lucky, and yet luck is a word that you don't want to have in that process. But I feel lucky that I was correctly positioned the first time. But Dr. Hicks, what about those who aren't recalled or are recalled for another screen because of positioning or technical issues? What are you observing that the patients are going through?
Well, those who aren't don't even realize that we, you know, that the problem was there, so they don't recognize it. Those who are recalled are very anxious. Obviously, it's a real anxiety-producing problem for them. And then for us, it's tough because we're trying to explain to them everything's okay. We recalled you because, you know, we didn't do a good job. And they're like, well, what kind of company is this if you're not doing a good job? You know, like you said, they want 100% perfection. But unfortunately, we try to explain we're humans and we don't always do perfection. So it's not easy, let me tell you. And again, our job is really one to try to help you as patients to find your cancers. And we are very passionate about it. We're trying our best, but it's hard.
Yeah. So one way to ensure standardization and reproducibility is to introduce guidelines. In the US, this has come through MQSA, obviously. But Dr. Hicks, can you describe the impact of guidelines on your service?
Well, so the guidelines have helped us and do help us. I really love the fact that we do have, audits, and that we do have systems in place on a national level and on a state level that do come into our systems and ask how we're doing and look at what we're doing. But the problem with that is that they, I feel, are somewhat lax in that they're more interested in what you're doing in your books and how your paperwork is and if every box has been checked, rather than how your images are and what kind of perfection you actually are doing. And also, you know, I always say you kind of have the answer to the question. You're oftentimes turning in images that you've already pre-screened, so you're turning in your best images. And they're not really screening the entire portfolio of what you're doing. So while it's good and it helps and it brings attention to the system and it brings attention to us as to where we're not doing a good job, I think it fails in the sense of not being capable of really auditing large proportions of what you're doing.
So in contrast to that, Rude, how does the LRCB, how is it designed to identify those outliers and provide expert training?
Well, what is incorporated in the Dutch screening program, we perform audits, as I mentioned. And during that audits, we on beforehand ask for a random sample per technician to send to our institute. And then our technologists, who only work for LSCB, they judge those images on more or less 25 objective criteria, like, is the buggy too high or too low? Is the nipple centralized, yes or no? Is the nipple, well, you know, in profile, there are a lot of objective things that you can decide upon whether the image is perfect or imperfect, to say so. And we think, and that's our criteria, that if you take that whole bunch of images from a screening unit, that at least 85% of those criteria has to be fulfilled. If not, then the technicians are invited for additional training, and if it's really bad, then they are up to more frequent audits. But you can imagine that it's a huge amount of work for our technicians to review all those images. So if we could get some help from artificial intelligence, that would be very, very beneficial, not only for our technicians, but also for the sample, because now we take a sample that is doable for our technicians. But if we can do that automated, then we can have a huge sample, and then we can get a better overview of how those technicians are actually performing.
Very interesting. So beyond guidelines, positioning and quality issues, I know are being addressed on a daily basis in both of your organizations through communication, continuous training. However, I understand communication can break down and continuous education can be perhaps too broad. If the centers do not have the analytics or the data to show what's working or whether it's working, you both have made mention of this, and they aren't able to focus specifically on the areas that need improvement. I'm curious, Dr. Hicks, how should radiologists work with their technologists to improve image quality? And what have you seen that works best? And what is the radiologist's responsibility in terms of the quality of that image?
So I think the responsibility question is really one that, lies solely on our shoulders, meaning as radiologists, that is our responsibility. So, we definitely have to bring it to the attention of the technologists, and we definitely have to train them. The challenge is around, time, and time is the issue. So what we've done at RMI is that we bring in national trainers into our center. We put all of our technologists into a training room together, and we do training. That most commonly it's at night, because obviously they don't do it during the day, but we do it about once a year. We bring those people in and they train all of our techs at the same time, and all of our technologists are taught by the same trainer, and then the trainer stays in touch with them throughout the year and manages to help them with those challenges. Now, as radiologists, we're in those training sessions with them, and we talk with them and work with them throughout the year. When they start to, I say kind of slack off and become more lax because they haven't been in their training for a while. And so we try to remind them now, don't forget to lift the breast and don't forget to position correctly on the oblique, and so we talk to them and talk through the teaching points. But I think, again, I've said it before, but it is a huge challenge for all of us. And we are in imaging centers that are 110 miles apart. So it is very difficult to do because the training needs to be hands-on, because they need to actually practice the techniques on the equipment. They can't do it on a Zoom video. It doesn't work. So, we got to put people 110 miles, get them together in a room inside the same building, and we've got to work on all of that. So it is tough.
Wow. So Ruth, I'm curious, how does LRCB address continuous improvement?
Well, it is in the program incorporated that there are on a frequent basis, there are meetings between radiologists and technicians. And we have some sort of, a click box. If you feel not comfortable with the positioning, if you think it's not optimal, you can point it out. And then in the next meeting, that will be discussed between radiologists and technicians. And what we're trying to create is not a blame and shame culture, but an improvement culture. And to be honest, it works more or less. And we learn from our technicians, and they learn from us, but they also learn from each other, because if we say, well, I would have been more convenient if you had displayed this or this a little bit more or less. And then she tells me, well, yeah, but it's always so very difficult. And then the other technicians say, oh, but I have a trick for that. So, so the interactive part is very, very important and brings you to a higher level. Absolutely.
That's great. Dr. Austin, in your initial comments, you were talking about how most AI solutions today are focused on other solutions other than positioning and correct positioning, and specifically image interpretation. Can you share how else it can support along the breast screening pathway?
Yeah, I think picking up on the theme of continuous improvement is the right way to answer this question, right? If we think about the entire patient pathway from start to finish, the only individual who really experiences all of those steps consecutively is the actual patient, in terms of what we're talking about. So like yourself, Mary Beth. And really the idea behind a lot of this discussion right now is, how do we actually make sure that every patient is not lucky, but that they go through a standard series of steps that are as standardized in one center as if you as they are in another center. So if you are attending one screening service, Mary Beth, that your experience and the way that you were diagnosed would have been identical to the experience that you would have had you gone to another site and location. I think that's a lot of what both Ruud and Randy are referring to in terms of thinking of these larger programs that they're having to oversee. And I think, you know, the fundamental part of this conversation, which really goes back to the way that I've spent a lot of my career in, not only in on the clinical side, but I've been in industry for over 10 years now, really looking at clinical workflows, dissecting those and looking where the noise is that Randy's referring to. And finding out that the humans aren't good at some of those tasks that computers really are. And we can go to other industries to really learn from that, and learn from certainly Edward Deming and a lot of the work that he's done in industrial manufacturing. There are great examples of mapping out those workflows, finding out where the noise is, and putting digital solutions in place to nudge the humans, to provide insight to the humans of what's working and what's not. And to kind of just you know, channel back to how we're thinking about that, and what I'm seeing in breast imaging in particular. That start of the experience around image quality and accurate positioning is just one example. The analytics that can come back from that to feedback to the actual technologists to help them improve, to provide data and analytics to the center to understand where those opportunities are to drive improvement is a great example. But I think all of us in this space can think of many other areas too that have some degree of subjectivity, like breast density categorization that is now mandatory for reporting in the United States. Thinking through that trajectory towards a more personalized set of recommendations based on the evidence. So allowing the computer technology or AI technology to also guide that decision making. Maybe this woman does not benefit from the traditional 2D image that they had before, and that tomosynthesis would be more appropriate, even though we're seeing much more adoption of that technology. How do we make sure that that woman doesn't go through a 2D and then a 3D exam subsequently, after having already been identified as having Class D dense breast previously, or maybe an ultrasound is warranted. So these are the kinds of decisions that I think will enable and empower the humans to be more efficient, to be smarter, and hopefully give you know, the better experience for the patients as they go through that workflow. And that's certainly how we're looking at the opportunities that AI presents us.
That's great. So Ruud, what are your thoughts about introducing AI to support image quality and breast positioning?
Yeah, that would be marvelous. At least for us, due to the fact that we screen 1 million women a year in the Netherlands in our national program. And what I mentioned before, it would be of great help if we can have a larger sample from all technicians in order to find out, not only on a daily basis or on an individual basis per client or patient, whatever you like to call women who attend screening. But I think it's very important that also in these cases, we look at big data. So we know the trend of this technician. Is she always putting the bucket too high or too low? And then we can directly re-educate them. Or is the nipple, or is that the problem, or whatever. So I think it's very important that we have more data. And now in the situation that we are faced with, it's impossible to have every image to be evaluated because there is no manpower enough to perform so. So AI would be very helpful for us in order to give a larger overview of the performance of our technicians.
And Dr. Hicks, how do you see a quality assurance tool working in your centers, and what benefits do you think it would bring, and how do you think your technologists would feel about it?
Yeah, well, I'm definitely with Ruud. I mean, I think it's just great. You know, like we would really embrace this technology. And as a matter of fact, we're working on getting Chiron to come into our centers. We just are really enthused by this because of the opportunity to learn and to try to get information in the hands of our technologists so they can get better. I think Christopher said it best. You know, the humans, the humans want to do the right thing. They just need the tools to do it. And we just don't have the manpower, as Ruth said, to teach it and to school them as much as they might need. But you can envision a day of real-time AI feedback that's giving them this all the time, every day, all day. And that's like having a school teacher in your room with you all day long. And it's really, really a good opportunity for us to really improve and elevate everybody to a really higher level. I think that's what we've learned using AI in interpretation, is it elevates all of us and makes us all better interpreters. And I think we'll be better managers of positioning. And that's so important, I think, in what we're doing, and will really change the whole spectrum of quality. And you, Mary Beth, and other women will feel much more secure knowing that centers are doing, a job that is being overseen every step of the way, all the time, real time. It's kind of like what happened to the auto industry. And we talk about industry, auto industry in Michigan is so important. And auto industry put all of these AI products in place and have, a lot of things happening with robots and AI and all kinds of things to improve quality. And we were way behind the Europeans in quality in the auto industry, and we have put a lot of technology behind it to catch up.
That's great. And so, finally, as we wrap up this panel, I'd love to invite each of you, starting with Chris and then Ruth and Dr. Hicks, to share a key message or an action that you would like everyone to take away from today.
Well, Mary Beth, I think a nice anecdote comes to my mind, and I should qualify. I am not a breast-trained radiologist by background, but during my residency, obviously, like all radiologists, we go through a breast rotation, and I went through my breast rotation in the pre-digital days. And what I really remember a lot is from that experience was the technologists who had to go and develop the images and bring them around and hang those images. And during my experience, I remember many cases where the technologists would actually just give us a heads up on some issues that they had during the time that they were positioning the patient, or they might have even flagged some of those to us at that time. And so as I think about, again, the role of AI in this particular part of the workflow, AI can be that technologist who in the previous world would have communicated more with the radiologist before digitization took place and the images are automatically there for us. So I see AI as that additional friend to drive continuous improvement and greater quality in a similar kind of fashion to what I experienced as a resident.
Great. And Ruth?
Well, I think as a whole overview of a screening program, I think a successful screening program consists of education, evaluation, and adjustment. And it is about the whole chain, equipment and professionals. And evaluation can be very helpful for this purpose, if you can be helped by artificial intelligence. And then you can educate to the point which they need it. So I think it's very beneficial, and it supports the three pillars of what we are doing. And it would be very grateful, at least I myself would be very grateful, if there was an AI system that could really perform as good as our technicians.
Excellent. Dr. Hicks?
So I think speaking to my colleagues and technologists out there that hopefully are listening to this, I would say, embrace technology. It is something that is going to change our world, or has changed our world in a tremendous way. And we've all felt the improvements of our lives from technology. And now we can use some of that technology to help improve patients' lives and to help improve, hopefully, some of the anxiety you might have around going home at night and worrying about those images that perhaps weren't perfect. So embrace technology, look at products like Chiron that has this available, and let's see how it does, and let's get ourselves elevated.
My deepest hope is that by leveraging AI, we can guarantee that all women will be lucky in having their cancer detected early. So we look forward to responding to your questions, which hopefully you've been submitting via the Q&A chat box at the bottom of the screen. The panel will now begin to respond to those questions. And Ruth, I've noticed that a question has come in regarding breast compression. And as we know, breast compression is so important. And in your Dutch screening program, do you have a special breast compression protocol? And then are your techs trained on that protocol?
Yeah, actually, techs are trained on compression because of two things. First of all, movement. And the second thing is, if you have an adequate compression, the radiation dose will be as low as reasonably possible. So yes, they are trained on it, and we are also auditing on the compression that has been given all over the period that we are looking for. Yes, definitely.
Great. So building on that theme, what do you find to be the most important criteria to get right on a mammogram to ensure that diagnostic quality?
For me, it is first of all blurring, because if there is blurring, I think that's really annoying, and sometimes it makes it very difficult to have a good reading. And the second thing is, and that's a criterion I always use, at the new mammogram, there has to be at least as much tissue being displayed as on the prior. So that's very important that the technician, first, before starting a mammogram, she has to look at the priors, because then she knows what is at least possible with this patient or client. So what we have installed in our system is that before starting the new screening, she has the possibility to look at the priors. And I think that's amazingly important.
That's great. Dr. Hicks, you're in the trench every day reading a lot of mammograms. What do you find to be the most difficult criteria to get right?
I would agree with Ruud. Blurring is a big problem. I think we see a lot of motion. Larger breasted women sometimes are a big problem for us in the challenge of kind of spacing, tiling those larger breasts. That's a really big problem. I agree that one of the issues we have is, I think digitalization has helped a lot in the review of prior mammograms prior to entering the room. And I'm really proud to say that we have, that capabilities everywhere, so our technologists can do that. I think that's so important. But I think a lot of centers don't do that, and I think that's not good. So I think trying to get the previous, trying to make sure we understand what we have, and then in the positioning part of it, I find the one issue we have, we have two issues on the CC, just not pulling in enough, and then on the MLO, missing the inferior mammary fold so commonly with just kind of sagging. So these are problems that we see all the time, every day.
That's amazing. How would you, Ruud and Dr. Hicks, characterize the biggest difference in the quality criteria between the US and the EU?
Well, I think that's quite difficult. I don't think that there is something like the EU, because every country itself has its own regulation and its own protocols. So I know that in some countries where there is a nationwide breast cancer screening program, that there are strict protocols, like in the Netherlands, and in other countries it's more loosened. So I think it's very difficult to compare EU with the US. As I know, also in the US, there's not a uniform protocol as well. So I think that you have to look in regions and in countries. And I know that we in the Netherlands are very strict, to be honest.
Yeah, I would mention and say, just in thought, that this is one of the great things that can occur with things like AI. So you can envision the day when the world is using artificial intelligence to help to regulate and evaluate entire portfolios, the whole nation's portfolio of positioning. And we could then answer the question, and Ruud and I could compete on that and try to get
I absolutely agree. And I think that AI can give us a standardization of positioning, definitely.
Exactly. And that will be the great thing that will occur.
So are
Mary
you,
Beth?
oh, go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah.
I was just going to add something too. I think to build on what they just said, I think that one of the key conversations we have when we talk to a lot of the organizations that we're working with around not only North America but outside as well, is I think that there is this this desire for greater standardization around positioning and really defining what those criteria are. Even though we have criteria, for example, here in the U.S., those criteria have not been as regularly updated as I know a lot of academics and proponents have been asking for those to be updated. And there are also requests for being able to benchmark performance. These kinds of benchmarks are happening in other parts of healthcare with chronic disease management to be able to understand how an organization is performing in managing certain cohorts or managing the diagnosis and treatment of different kinds of diseases. And I think this just opens up another opportunity to provide those benchmarks and move towards greater standardization of what good should look like. Because I think at this stage, nobody has a monopoly on that.
So Rune and Dr. Hicks, are you anticipating that if AI flags an image as inadequate in some way, that it would be retaken every time? And would you anticipate that this might lead to longer appointment times or additional radiation?
Well, that's an issue we have been thinking about very thoroughly already, because what we don't want to do is get into the same problems as we have seen with CAD for radiologists, so the computer-aided detection. Because every time there was a pop-up of messages from the CAD system, and then they were ignored by radiologists. So maybe it's not, we don't know, we have to do research on that, but maybe it's not the issue to give feedback after every mammography, but you take a couple of mammographies and then you get an impression of what is the most common failure for that technician. And I think that might be more important and more educational than having feedback on every mammography. Indeed, you have the risk of having more radiation and the risk of having more time-consuming mammographies, definitely.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. But what I would add to that is I think that what will happen over time, if I can look into the future, is I believe that over time, you'll get to the point where you will accumulate data in the way that each technologist will have their own data sets, but there will also be like a stop where the AI product will say, this just is not acceptable. You know, this image is not acceptable. You need to repeat it. And that will happen. And I mean, I can think on probably a weekly basis of where we have these images are not acceptable and they have to be repeated, and the technologist didn't do so. But there will be a stop and it will say, go back and repeat. That's a good thing.
Sure. Or that they say this is not acceptable, or make a retake, or give an explanation for
right.
You know,
or call the radiologist.
Great. So Dr. Hicks, I'm interested to hear some of the best practices that you've seen emerge between your radiologists and technologists to improve breast positioning. And similarly, what best practices has Ruud seen as he looks across many of the programs in the Netherlands?
Yeah, in our practice, the best thing that's occurred to us is the team approach, where we learn together and we go into meetings together to actually work on positioning. And when I say that, you know, when we bring in a national positioning expert to work with us, we all work as a team and do it in team smaller groups, but we all learn together. That's been the best for us because we each have now the same knowledge base, and it's not teacher teaching student, it's teacher and teacher working together to try to get better. So we feel better about that, and we like working in teams.
I absolutely agree that we are performing the same way. Bring the team together and then discuss the images. And for instance, in the Dutch screening program, we have a tick box on which we can say, this is not what we would like as a positioning. And then afterwards, we can discuss that. with the radiologist and the group of technologists. And then we can say, how come? I would like to see this or that. And they say, well, it's impossible because of. So you have a lively discussion, and that is going to improve your quality definitely.
That's great. You know, one of the questions that came in was a question for me about how I, as a woman, would feel about an algorithm reading your mammogram. I am so anxious today, knowing that I am dependent on humans doing their jobs perfectly, that I would love to have that extra set of eyes just observing the process and taking the noise out of it and ensuring that it works perfectly every single time. So I can't wait. I look for the day when I will be going into my imaging center and AI will be sitting on my shoulder, my guardian angel, making sure that I am just going right through the process perfectly. So
yeah, I can imagine, and be aware of the fact that it's not only AI or only the radiologist. It's just like in the flying industry. There is no plane leaving without a pilot and a computer. They fly together. And I think that's the challenge we are facing for as radiologists, to do the same thing. Use the computer in order to bring it safely on the ground.
Yeah, that's a brilliant statement, and I agree 100%. Having used AI in interpretation for 2.5 years, I can tell you the computer makes me better, but I make the computer better. And there's no question. I mean, studies show that that's the case, and the two combined are brilliant. And you know, you can't do one without the other at this point. I don't know. We'll see what the future holds, but for now, it's pretty strong. The two combined are massively good together.
Yeah.
well, on that note, I think this has been a wonderful session, and thank you all so much. Thank you for attending. Dr. Hicks, thank you. Ruth, thank you for your expertise. And Chris, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate the time with you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Mary Beth.